Today's story is written by Mary Martin, and she was 24 and working at home here in England. "Watch out!" I cried, squeezing the brakes as hard as I could. Eva jumped out of the way of my motorcycle just in time, toppling over into the mud with a squelch. I skidded to a halt, swung off the bike and rushed over to help her. "Why did you run out in front of me?" I asked, hefting Eva on her feet. "You could have been flattened." Far from looking put out, Eva's eyes were all alight with excitement. "Sorry," she said, not sounding sorry in the slightest. "But we've just heard. We've won. It's over, Mary. At least, almost over. It won't be long until the Japanese throw in the towel." She crushed me into a hug. Eva hardly came up to my chin, and I got a sharp jab in the cheek from her ATS badge attached to her hat. "Really?" I asked, as soon as she released me. "Truly," Eva said breathlessly. "Churchill made an announcement at 3 o'clock. The Germans have surrendered. I've been hunting the yard, waiting for you to come back since." I pulled off my helmet and began to lug my motorcycle towards the shed. My body ached from the bumpy journey home. Many of the roads between Sunderland and the base of Goosepool were still littered with debris from air raids, and navigating the potholes in the dark could be perilous for a dispatch rider on 2 wheels. Once the bike was safely stowed, we turned back towards the hostel. "Aren't you excited?" Eva asked. "Of course," I replied, forcing my mouth into a smile. "Where's Betty?" "Probably in our room, curling her—" "Girls!" Eva and I froze at the booming voice of our officer. We snapped to attention as she approached. "The war may be over, but that is no reason to let the standards of the Auxiliary Tutorial Service slip. Mary, I could forgive your appearance, as I assume you've just got back from a delivery. But Eva, there is no excuse for the state of your uniform." With me muttering apologies and Eva stifling giggles, we headed up to our dorm. "You two look ghastly," Betty said, glancing up as we came into the room. She was perched on the edge of her bed, twisting dinky curlers into her hair. Eva stuck out her tongue. The 3 of us had bunked together since our driver training 4 years ago. The pair of them were as different as coal and custard. Betty a society girl from London, and Eva a farmer's daughter from Bristol. But we had found a way to muddle along together. Women in the ATS could take on all sorts of jobs, from cooks to clerks, ammunition inspectors to searchlight operators, anything that freed up the men for the fighting. But all 3 of us had known we wanted to be drivers from the outset. Eva and I could already handle a vehicle. She had learnt to drive in her father's tractor, and I in my father's furniture delivery truck. Betty hadn't a clue about driving, but she wanted to join the transport division because Princess Elizabeth had. My mother had begged me to train as a nurse rather than join the ATS. She'd been a nurse in Kingston, Jamaica, before she moved to Sunderland after the First World War. I'd seen her struggle to find employment in this country and didn't want to face the daily prejudice she still suffered. Not that driving the ATS was easy. As an ambulance driver, I'd attended countless raids. The worst came when, in May 1943, many people were killed at the Sunderland shipyards in a single attack. Reg had held me for hours afterwards. I couldn't stop shaking, trying to get the awful scene out of my head. "There's a mug of tea for you there. It might still be warm," Betty told me as I changed into my off-duty uniform, a khaki skirt and pressed shirt. "I don't know how I'm going to get my hair finished before lights out." "You could always wear it straight," suggested Eva. "Like Hitler." Betty threw a curler at her with a shriek. A few hours later, the 3 of us slipped into our beds. Betty and Eva whispered about their plans to go into Sunderland for the celebrations the next day, until eventually they dropped off. Once I was sure they were asleep, I reached under my pillow and pulled out the letter I had received a year before. It was too dark to read it, but I knew the note off by heart. "On behalf of the Royal Air Force, I regret to inform you that your husband, Flight Lieutenant Reginald Martin, has been killed as a result of air operations over Sicily. I extend to you my sincere sympathy on your great loss." We'd been married barely a year when it happened. He had lived on the base too, and we had met at one of the weekly dances held in the mess hall. Some of the other airmen had given me a wide berth, and a couple of the American GIs even made awful comments under their breath. I knew they forced their black soldiers to live, eat and work separately, and were probably horrified to learn that a mixed-race woman was sharing a dorm with 2 white girls. But Reg had come right over and asked if I wanted to dance. We'd whirled around the floor all night, chatting and laughing like we were the only 2 people in the room. Each time he was back on leave, Reg and I would go to the pictures or stroll around the base. When he got down on one knee, it was easy to say yes. It was a proper wartime wedding, with both of us in uniform. We weren't married long, but it was wonderful. When the note came informing me of his death, my world fell apart. I would never again breathe in the warm smell of his overcoat or hear him whistle "We'll Meet Again," his favourite wartime tune. We would never make the plans to visit my mother's hometown in Jamaica. It was those little absences that added up to one great loss. After the letter, I couldn't face getting back into an ambulance and seeing any more death. I'd retrained as a dispatch rider, trading 4 wheels for 2 and delivering messages across the country. It was the ATS that had pulled me out of the darkness, really. It had given me a reason to get up each day and put on my uniform and do something useful. For now, the war was over. Once the men came home, would we still be needed? I lay uneasily in the darkness, worrying. I had almost lost Reg. Was I about to lose my job and my friends too? Boom! I leaped out of bed. Eva flung off her blanket and Betty sat bolt upright, staring wildly around the room, looking for the source of the almighty crash. "Was that a bomb?" Betty asked. "Surely not," said Eva. "It had been months and months since we'd had an air raid. Besides, the war was supposed to be over." I pulled on my coat and boots and headed out into the yard. The base was in a ruckus, with RAF men swarming around in the dark. "What happened?" I asked a flight officer, rushing past me, heading back towards the girls' hostel. "A few men got carried away with the celebrations and let off some shells from the vessel anchored on the River Weir," he said, rolling his eyes. I followed him back up the steps into the hostel and through another dormitory. Sure enough, a 20mm shell had struck the ceiling, leaving a gaping hole. The bed beneath was dusted in plaster, and 3 ATS girls huddled together in their nightclothes, looking shaken. It seemed the drama of war wasn't quite over yet. The following weeks slipped by in a haze of celebrations. Although I had tried to join in, I often felt like I was floating above it all. Betty and Eva returned to London and to Bristol. It was hard to say goodbye, but we swore we'd write to each other every week. I stayed on at a base, granted extended services terms, to continue working as a dispatch rider. There were still messages to deliver, and after all, I was determined to stay in uniform for as long as I could. I was putting my motorcycle away one July afternoon, the yard dusty in the sunlight, when a shadow fell across the floor of the shed. I turned around and saw an impossible sight. I had to grip my bike to stop me from falling. Reg stood in the doorway, thin, pale, and with shadow-like bruises beneath his eyes. I reached out a hand to grip his arm to make sure he was real. "Mary," he said. And with that one word, the whole war came tumbling down around us. Reg explained he had survived the crash, bailed out and been captured by the enemy. He had spent the time in a prisoner of war camp in Bavaria in Germany, with no way of getting word to me. He was horrified to discover I had received a telegram telling me of his death, and even more horrified to learn I had slept with it under my pillow for all this time. We knew we were lucky. There were so many that hadn't come home. As we walked arm in arm across the base, the future suddenly didn't seem quite so daunting. Whatever hardships the next few years would bring, we could face them together.